The icy Montana wind cut through the valley like a knife, but Rebecca Turner didn't feel the cold beneath her bare feet anymore. Numbness had crept up her ankles, replacing pain with a dangerous absence of feeling as she stood motionless in the deepening snow, staring at the burned remains of what had once been her family's homestead. The year 1875 had been cruel to the 22-year-old, taking her parents in the spring fever and now, on the cusp of winter, claiming her home and belongings to a lightning strike that had ignited the dry timber roof while she'd been at the creek washing clothes. "Madam, you'll catch your death standing barefoot in the snow like that." Rebecca turned, meeting the concerned gaze of a tall stranger atop a chestnut stallion. His face was partially concealed by a woolen scarf, but his eyes, sharp and blue as a summer sky, studied her with unmistakable concern. He dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing the practiced ease of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. "Let's go inside," the cowboy said, nodding toward the small stable that stood mercifully untouched by the fire, some 50 yards from the smoldering ruins. Rebecca didn't move. "There's nothing left," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and smoke. "Everything's gone." The stranger removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders in one swift movement. "Name's Jackson Vance. I was passing through when I saw the smoke. The stable's still standing, and it'll be warmer than out here. You can't stay in this cold with no shoes." When Rebecca still didn't respond, he bent down and lifted her into his arms. She was too numb physically and emotionally to protest as he carried her toward the stable, her bare feet dangling limply beneath the hem of her soot-stained dress. "I've got supplies," Jackson said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Food, blankets. We'll get you warm, then figure out what comes next." The stable was small but solid, built by Rebecca's father 3 years prior when they'd first claimed this patch of Montana territory. Inside, Jackson set her down on a pile of hay and quickly built a fire in the small stone hearth her father had constructed for just such emergencies. "Your feet need tending," he said, pulling a flask from his saddlebag. "This'll sting, but it'll help ward off frostbite." Rebecca winced as he poured whiskey over her frozen feet, then wrapped them in clean bandages from his pack. The pain meant feeling was returning, a good sign, though hardly a comfort. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, watching him work with skilled, efficient movements. Jackson didn't look up. "My pa taught me never to ride past someone in need, especially not out here where the land is as likely to kill you as nurture you." He finished bandaging her feet and finally met her eyes. "What's your name?" "Rebecca Turner. My parents and I came from Pennsylvania 3 years ago." She glanced toward the doorway, beyond which lay the charred skeleton of her home. "They died of fever last spring. I've been managing alone since." Jackson nodded solemnly. "That's a heavy burden for one person. You have any family nearby, anyone you can stay with?" Rebecca shook her head. "Nearest neighbors are the Hendersons, about 5 miles east, but they're struggling themselves this winter." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the small fire and the occasional stomp of Jackson's horse, tethered just outside the stable door. Then Jackson stood and rummaged through his saddlebags, producing a small pot, some dried beans, and salt pork. "First things first, you need food and rest. Tomorrow we can salvage what we can from the house and figure out your next steps." He set about preparing a simple stew over the fire. "I was heading to Whitefish anyway. There's work there for the winter. I can take you that far at least." Rebecca watched this stranger, this unexpected savior, move with confidence around the small space. In the firelight, she could see him clearly now. Strong jaw darkened with several days' growth of beard, weathered skin that spoke of years under harsh sun and wind, and those striking blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "You don't even know me," she said softly. Jackson glanced at her, a hint of a smile softening his features. "I know enough. You're alive, which means you're strong, and right now you need help." He shrugged, returning his attention to the stew. "Out here, that's all that matters." As night deepened around them, Rebecca felt the first genuine warmth since discovering her home ablaze hours earlier. It wasn't just the fire or the borrowed coat, it was the presence of this man, this Jackson Vance, who had appeared like an apparition when she'd needed help most desperately. Try to get some sleep, Jackson said, handing her a tin cup of steaming stew. Tomorrow will be a long day. Rebecca accepted the cup, their fingers brushing momentarily. Thank you, she said, the words wholly inadequate for what she felt. He nodded once, then turned to tend to his horse, leaving Rebecca to wonder what providence had brought this cowboy to her doorstep on this, the darkest day of her life. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through cracks in the stable walls. Rebecca woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting the previous day's tragedy. Reality crashed back when she tried to stand and felt the sharp pain in her feet. Easy there, Jackson cautioned, already awake and rekindling the fire. Those feet need another day or two before you should be walking much on them. I need to see what can be salvaged, Rebecca insisted, pushing herself up despite the pain. Jackson studied her for a moment, then nodded. Stubborn, that'll serve you well out here. He rose and offered his hand. Let me help at least, and you'll need these. He produced a pair of moccasins from his pack. They're not fancy, but they'll protect your feet better than nothing. Rebecca slipped them on, grateful for his foresight. Together they ventured out into the bright, cold morning to survey the devastation. The cabin was gone, that much was clear. Only the stone chimney remained standing, a solitary monument to what had once been home. The snow around the ruins had melted from the heat of the fire, leaving a blackened circle of earth that steamed slightly in the morning air. Let's see what we can find, Jackson said gently, approaching the ruins with careful steps. They spent hours sifting through the debris. Rebecca found her mother's iron skillet, blackened but intact. A small metal box containing her family Bible had survived, the edges of the pages singed but the interior largely preserved. A few tools, some kitchenware, and surprisingly, a trunk containing some of her clothes had been partially protected when the roof collapsed in such a way that it shielded the contents from the worst of the flames. It's more than I expected, Rebecca said, wiping soot from her hands onto her already filthy dress. But not enough to start over here. Jackson nodded, loading the salvaged items onto his horse. The offer to take you to Whitefish stands. Winter's coming fast and you need a roof over your head. Rebecca looked around at the land her father had chosen with such hope. The mountains rose in the distance, dusted with early snow. The creek where she'd been washing clothes bubbled nearby, its constant rhythm unchanged by her personal tragedy. Everything looked the same, yet everything was different. What would I do in Whitefish, she asked, more to herself than to Jackson. Survive, he answered simply. Then decide what comes next when spring arrives. Rebecca Turner was not a woman accustomed to accepting charity or relying on strangers, but as she stood amid the ruins of her life, she recognized the wisdom in his words. Sometimes survival had to come before pride. All right, she said finally, to Whitefish. They spent another night in the stable, preparing for the journey. Jackson explained it would take 3 days of riding to reach the growing settlement near the mountains. He'd been there the previous winter, working at a logging camp, and knew of a widow who took in boarders. Mrs. Hollister is stern but fair, he explained as they shared the last of the stew. She might have worked for you too. She's always complaining about needing help with the washing and cooking for her boarders. And you, Rebecca asked, you'll go back to the logging camp, Jackson nodded. It's hard work, but the pay is decent, and it sees me through until spring roundup starts. They set out at dawn the next morning, Rebecca riding behind Jackson on his stallion. She'd taken one last look at the homestead, silently promising her parents she would return someday before turning her face toward the mountains and whatever future awaited her there. The journey to Whitefish tested Rebecca's endurance. Though her feet were healing, sitting in the saddle for hours left her sore and stiff. The cold grew more intense as they gained elevation, and the nights spent camping under the stars were a harsh reminder of how vulnerable they were to the elements. Yet there was beauty too. The Montana wilderness stretched around them in all directions, untamed and magnificent. Eagles soared overhead, and once they spotted a small herd of elk moving through a distant meadow. When they stopped to rest or make camp, Jackson proved to be a surprisingly good companion, quiet but attentive, with occasional dry humor that made Rebecca smile despite her circumstances. How long have you been a cowboy? She asked on their second night as they sat beside a small fire, the stars blazing overhead in a black velvet sky. Since I was 16, he replied, sipping coffee from a battered tin cup. Started as a wrangler in Texas, then drove cattle up the goodnight-loving trail. Been drifting ever since, working wherever there's honest pay to be had. No home. Rebecca wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Jackson stared into the fire. The West is my home. Never felt the need to stake a claim like your father did. But don't you get lonely? Moving place to place, never putting down roots. He was silent for so long that Rebecca thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was softer than usual. Sometimes, but I've seen what happens to folks who start believing a place or a person belongs to them. Life has a way of proving them wrong. He set his cup down and added another stick to the fire. Getting attached just makes it harder when it's time to move on. Rebecca considered his words. My father used to say that nothing worth having comes without risk. Even if we lose what we love, having it for a time is better than never having it at all. Jackson's eyes met hers across the fire, something unreadable in their blue depths. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Rebecca said, her throat tightening with grief. I miss him and my mother. Every day. That kind of love doesn't just disappear, Jackson said, surprising her with his insight. It stays with you, becomes part of who you are. They fell silent after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned down to embers and the night deepened around them. On the afternoon of the third day, they crested a rise and Whitefish came into view. It wasn't much a cluster of log buildings nestled in a valley, smoke rising from chimneys, the gleaming ribbon of a partially frozen river winding alongside it. But to Rebecca, it represented shelter, safety, and the possibility of a new beginning. It's not much to look at, Jackson said, but it's growing. The Northern Pacific Railroad surveyors came through last year. If they decide to bring the track this way, Whitefish will boom. They rode into town just as the winter sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the muddy Main Street. People hurried about their business, eager to finish the day's tasks before darkness and deeper cold set in. A few curious glances were cast their way. Newcomers were still noteworthy in a settlement this small, but most folk were too concerned with their own affairs to pay them much mind. Jackson guided his horse toward a two-story log building set slightly apart from the others. A hand-painted sign identified it as Hollister Boarding House, and smoke billowed invitingly from its stone chimney. Let me do the talking, Jackson said as he helped Rebecca dismount. Her legs nearly buckled after the long ride, and he steadied her with a strong hand on her arm. Mrs. Hollister can be particular about who she takes in. The widow Hollister proved to be a formidable woman in her 60s, with iron gray hair pulled severely back from a face that had seen its share of hardship. She eyed Rebecca with undisguised assessment as Jackson explained the situation. Lost everything, you say? Mrs. Hollister's sharp eyes noted Rebecca's soot-stained dress and the makeshift moccasins on her feet. And you're proposing I take her in out of charity, Mr. Vance? Not charity, Rebecca interjected before Jackson could respond. I'm willing to work. I can cook, clean and I learn quickly. I'll earn my keep. Mrs. Hollister's expression remained stern, but something like approval flickered in her eyes. Can you now? Well, I suppose I could use another pair of hands. The miners and loggers keep me busier than I care to be at my age. She turned to Jackson. And you'll be back at Thorson's camp, I expect. Jackson nodded. If he'll have me. Oh, he'll have you. Good workers are scarce, and you proved yourself last winter. Mrs. Hollister turned back to Rebecca. Very well, Miss Turner, you may stay. We'll see if your work matches your words. $6 a month for room and board, which I'll deduct from whatever wages you earn helping me. Thank you, Rebecca said, relief washing over her. I won't disappoint you, see that you don't. The older woman opened the door wider. Come in then. Supper's nearly ready and you look half frozen. Rebecca turned to Jackson, suddenly reluctant to part from the man who had saved her life and brought her to safety. Will you stay for supper at least? He shook his head. Best get to the camp before full dark. Thorson likes to know who's coming and going. He hesitated, then added, I'll check on you when I come to town. Make sure you're settling in all right. Thank you, Rebecca said again, the words still inadequate, for everything. Jackson touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. You take care of yourself, Rebecca Turner. With that, he mounted his horse and rode off toward the edge of town, where the logging road began its climb into the surrounding forest. Rebecca watched him go, a strange emptiness settling in her chest. Then Mrs. Hollister cleared her throat pointedly, and Rebecca turned to follow her inside, toward the warmth and light of her temporary new home. Life at the Hollister boarding house quickly settled into a demanding routine. Rebecca rose before dawn each day to help prepare breakfast for the 12 men who currently boarded there, a mix of miners, trappers, and town workers. After serving the morning meal, there was washing up, room cleaning, laundry, bread baking, and preparation for the evening meal. Mrs. Hollister worked alongside her, and though the older woman rarely offered praise, her criticisms became less frequent as Rebecca proved her worth. The work was exhausting but welcome. Physical fatigue meant dreamless sleep, and the busy days left little time for dwelling on all she had lost. Still, in quiet moments hanging laundry in the cold backyard or darning socks by lamplight after the evening chores were done, grief would sweep over her unexpectedly, leaving her breathless with its intensity. December arrived, bringing deeper cold and shorter days. The boarding house remained warm, thanks to constantly fed wood stoves and the heat generated by so many bodies under one roof. Rebecca slowly accumulated a small store of personal possessions, a new dress purchased with her first wages, a pair of sturdy boots donated by a kindly trapper who'd found them too small, a hairbrush from Mrs. Hollister, when the older woman noticed Rebecca using a comb with missing teeth. True to his word, Jackson Vance appeared in town every few weeks when the logging camp sent men for supplies. His visits to the boarding house were brief, just long enough to inquire after Rebecca's welfare, and perhaps stay for a meal if his timing coincided with breakfast or supper. Each time, Rebecca found herself watching the door in anticipation on the days she knew the logging camp wagon was due in town. That cowboy of yours is different from the usual drifters, Mrs. Hollister remarked one evening in late December as they cleared the supper dishes. Jackson had taken his meal with them earlier, sitting quietly at the end of the long table, answering the other boarders' questions about conditions at the logging camp with his typical economy of words. "He's not my cowboy," Rebecca protested, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. Mrs. Hollister's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held knowing amusement. "Well, whatever he is or isn't, he's cut from different cloth than most. Thorson says he works harder than men 10 years younger, never complains, and doesn't drink away his pay like the others." She stacked plates with practiced efficiency. "That's rare in these parts." Rebecca said nothing, but the older woman's words stayed with her as she went about her evening tasks. She had thought often of Jackson in the weeks since arriving in Whitefish, his unexpected kindness, the quiet strength he exuded, the brief glimpses of humor and insight that suggested depths beneath his reserved exterior. But she'd been careful to keep her manner friendly but formal during his visits, uncertain of his feelings and unwilling to appear too forward, or, worse, as if she expected something from him beyond the help he'd already provided. The following week brought a heavy snowstorm that isolated Whitefish for several days. When the weather finally cleared, the temperature plummeted to bitter cold that even the locals found remarkable. The boarding house remained busy as usual. Men still needed to eat, sheets still needed washing, floors still needed sweeping, but even short excursions outdoors became exercises in endurance. It was during this cold snap, as January neared its midpoint, that Jackson Vance arrived at the boarding house unexpectedly one evening, long after supper had been served and cleared away. Rebecca was alone in the kitchen, finishing the washing up while Mrs. Hollister tended to a boarder who'd fallen ill with a chest cold. When a knock came at the back door. Opening it, she found Jackson on the threshold, snow dusting his shoulders and hat. His face looked drawn with exhaustion, and he swayed slightly on his feet. "Jackson," she exclaimed, pulling him inside immediately. "What are you doing here in this weather? The camp's a half-day's ride in good conditions." "Accident at the camp," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "Man got his leg crushed. I volunteered to ride for the doctor. Doctor." "Simmons is out at the Peterson place," Rebecca told him, leading him to a chair by the kitchen stove. "Their youngest came down with scarlet fever 2 days ago. He's not expected back until morning at earliest." Jackson ran a hand over his face. "Damn, Thorson was afraid of that." "Told me to try anyway," said Jenkins wouldn't make it otherwise. Rebecca could see now how truly exhausted he was. His face was pale beneath its weather-darkened tan, and he'd clearly pushed himself to the limit to make the journey in such conditions. "You need food and rest," she said firmly, moving to the stove where a pot of stew had been kept warm for Mrs. Hollister's midnight meal. "When did you last eat?" "This morning, I think." He made as if to stand. "But I should get back. You'll do no such thing," Rebecca cut him off, pressing him back into the chair. "You're half frozen and exhausted. Going back now would only result in 2 men needing rescue instead of 1. She ladled stew into a bowl and set it before him with a chunk of bread. "Eat. Then we'll figure out what to do about your friend." Too tired to argue, Jackson began to eat while Rebecca poured him coffee. She watched him with concern, noting the way his hands trembled slightly from cold and fatigue. "There's a free room upstairs," she said when he'd finished eating. "Mrs. Hollister's been holding it for a railroad man who's expected next week. You can rest there while I find Mrs. Hollister and see if she has any ideas about the doctor." Jackson nodded gratefully. "Thank you. I didn't know where else to go." "You came to the right place," Rebecca assured him, feeling a surge of protectiveness toward this man who had helped her without hesitation in her hour of need. Now it was her turn to reciprocate. Mrs. Hollister, when located, proved unexpectedly resourceful. "Jenkins, you say, with a crushed leg. He'll need that set properly or gangrene will set in," she thought for a moment. "There's an Ojibwe woman north of town, Moon Woman they call her. She set bones before when the doctor wasn't available. She might help." "Would she come to the camp?" Jackson asked, hope kindling in his tired eyes. "For the right payment, perhaps. She's wary of white men's camps with good reason." Mrs. Hollister turned to Rebecca. "You should go with him to ask. She might be more willing if another woman is present." Rebecca nodded without hesitation. "Of course, but Jackson needs rest first. He's exhausted." 4 hours, Jackson insisted. "Then we need to leave with or without this Moon Woman." Mrs. Hollister's expression softened slightly the closest she came to showing open concern. 4 hours it is. Rebecca will wake you." She turned to Rebecca. "Get some rest yourself, girl. You'll need your strength too." 4 hours later, in the darkest part of night, Rebecca and Jackson set out on a pair of horses borrowed from the livery stable, whose owner owed Mrs. Hollister a favor. The cold was brutal, stealing breath and stinging exposed skin. They rode in silence, conserving energy, following a faint trail through snow-laden pines toward a small cabin Mrs. Hollister had marked on a crude map. "Thank you for coming," Jackson said after they'd been riding for nearly an hour. "You didn't have to do this." Rebecca glanced at him, his profile just visible in the starlight reflecting off the snow. "You didn't have to help me either that day at my homestead, but you did." Moon Woman's cabin appeared as a darker shadow against the night, nestled among trees at the edge of a frozen pond. A thin wisp of smoke rose from its chimney, the only sign of habitation. They approached cautiously, as Mrs. Hollister had advised, and waited at a respectful distance while Jackson called out a greeting. The door opened, spilling amber light onto the snow. A woman emerged, wrapped in furs, her face lined with age and wisdom. She spoke no English, but through gestures and the few Ojibwe words Mrs. Hollister had taught them, they managed to convey their request. After what seemed an eternity of consideration, Moon Woman nodded once and disappeared back into her cabin. She emerged minutes later with a leather bag and additional furs. Without a word, she mounted behind Rebecca, and they set off toward the logging camp, now racing against time and cold to save a man's life. Dawn was breaking as they reached the camp, a collection of rough cabins surrounding a larger cookhouse, all dusted with fresh snow that glittered rose gold in the first light. Men emerged from cabins as they arrived, faces grim with concern. The injured man had been moved to the cookhouse, where the largest stove kept the space somewhat warmer than the bunkhouses. Rebecca waited outside with the horses while Jackson escorted Moon Woman inside. The loggers regarded her with curiosity. Women were rare in such remote camps, but kept their distance, respecting her privacy as she stomped her feet to keep warm and tried not to think about what might be happening inside. After what seemed hours but was likely less than one, Jackson emerged from the cookhouse, his face weary but relieved. "She set the leg," he told Rebecca. "Says it was a clean break, which is fortunate." She gave him something for the pain and showed the cook how to make a poultice to prevent infection. He ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing in unruly spikes. Thorson's beside himself with gratitude. He's giving her enough supplies to see her through till spring. "Will the man recover?" Rebecca asked, genuine concern in her voice, though she'd never met the injured logger. "Moon Woman thinks so if infection doesn't set in. He's young and strong." Jackson's expression softened as he looked at her. "I don't know how to thank you, Rebecca." "You didn't hesitate to help a stranger." "Neither did you," she reminded him. "That day you found me." Something shifted in his gaze, then a warming, a recognition. Before he could speak, however, Thorson himself emerged from the cookhouse, a barrel-chested man with a voice to match his imposing frame. "Miss Turner," he boomed, striding toward them. "Jack here tells me you're responsible for bringing Moon Woman to help Jenkins." "The boys and I are mighty grateful." Rebecca shook her head. "Mrs. Hollister knew who to ask. I just came along." "Modesty, too," Thorson said approvingly. "Well, you both look dead on your feet. We've got a spare bunk in the foreman's cabin for you, Miss Turner, and Jack can take his usual spot. Get some rest, and we'll see you both fed proper when you wake." Despite her exhaustion, Rebecca found it difficult to sleep in the strange surroundings. The foreman's cabin was clean enough, and she had privacy behind a curtain that had been hastily hung, but the sounds of the campmen's voices, axes being sharpened, the creak of timber in the cold were unfamiliar and kept her hovering on the edge of consciousness. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to the sound of the cabin door opening and the smell of food. Sitting up, she found Jackson setting a tray on the small table near her bunk. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said apologetically. "Cook sent this over, said you needed feeding up." Rebecca pushed hair from her face and smiled gratefully. "What time is it?" "Mid-afternoon. You slept about 6 hours." He hesitated, then added, "Moon Woman left an hour ago. Thorson sent 2 men to escort her home safely." Rebecca nodded, relieved to hear the Ojibwe healer would be protected on her journey. "How's the injured man?" "Resting easier. Moon Woman's medicine seems to be working. The fever we feared hasn't appeared." Jackson sat on a chair near the bunk, watching as Rebecca ate the stew and biscuits the cook had provided. "Thorson says we should stay at least until tomorrow. The weather's turning again." As if to emphasize his point, wind rattled the cabin's single window, driving snow against the glass. Rebecca shivered, grateful to be inside. "Mrs. Hollister will worry," she said, though the thought of riding back through worsening weather held little appeal. "Thorson sent word with the supply wagon this morning. She knows you're safe." Jackson's expression turned serious. "Rebecca, I've been thinking about what happens when spring comes." The abrupt change of subject caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I've saved most of what I've earned these past few years. Not much to spend it on out here. Come spring, I was thinking of heading to Idaho Territory. There's good land there, I hear, in the Palouse country. Fertile soil, decent rainfall." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I could build a cabin before the next winter, a proper one with glass windows and a good stone fireplace." Rebecca set down her spoon, her heart suddenly racing. "Jackson, what are you saying?" His blue eyes met hers directly. "I'm saying I care for you, Rebecca Turner, more than I expected to care for anyone again, and if you felt something similar." He trailed off, uncertainty crossing his features. "Are you asking me to come to Idaho with you?" Rebecca asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "As my wife," he clarified, his voice growing firmer. "If you'll have me." Rebecca stared at him, this man who had entered her life on its darkest day and brought light back into it, bit by bit. She thought of his quiet strength, his unfailing kindness, the way his rare smiles transformed his weathered face into something heart-stoppingly handsome. She thought of how empty the days seemed when he was away at the logging camp, and how her spirits lifted whenever he appeared at the boarding house door. "I know it's sudden," Jackson continued when she didn't immediately respond, "and I'm not a man of means or education. But I'm a hard worker and I do everything in my power to make you happy." "Yes," Rebecca said, the word escaping before she'd fully formed the thought. Jackson blinked. "Yes," a smile spread across Rebecca's face, bringing warmth to her cheeks. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll go to Idaho." Yes to all of it. For a moment, Jackson seemed frozen in disbelief. Then, in one fluid movement, he crossed the small space between them and took her hands in his. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. "It won't be an easy life." "I'm sure," Rebecca said firmly. "Life isn't meant to be easy, Jackson. It's meant to be lived fully with purpose and love." She squeezed his hands. "My father would have liked you, you know. You remind me of him, a man of few words but deep feeling." Jackson's smile transformed his face, erasing the weariness and worry of the past day. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, but it sent warmth cascading through Rebecca's body like nothing she'd ever experienced. When they parted, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I've been alone a long time," he murmured. "Thought that was how it would always be." "Not anymore," Rebecca promised, feeling as though her heart might burst with unexpected joy. "Not ever again." Outside, the storm intensified, snow and wind howling around the sturdy walls of the cabin. But inside, Rebecca Turner and Jackson Vance had found a shelter more enduring than timber and nails, the warmth of love discovered in the midst of winter's harshest days. The weeks that followed were filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and impatience. Rebecca returned to her duties at the boarding house, but everything felt different now. Her future had a shape, a direction, a companion. Mrs. Hollister, upon hearing the news, had simply nodded as if confirming something she'd known all along. "He's a good man," was her only comment, though Rebecca caught the older woman watching her with something like maternal pride in the days that followed. Jackson remained at the logging camp until the early thaw in March made the work too dangerous to continue. The melting snow and softening ground created hazardous conditions for felling and transporting trees, so Thorson paid the men their winter wages and released them until the ground firmed up again. Rebecca and Jackson were married on the first truly warm day of spring in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who had arrived in Whitefish just 2 days prior. Mrs. Hollister hosted the celebration at the boarding house, surprising everyone with her generosity in providing food and drink for the occasion. The boarders, along with most of the logging camp workers and various townspeople who had come to know Rebecca during her months in Whitefish, crowded into the dining room to wish the couple well. "Never seen Jack smile so much," Thorson commented to Mrs. Hollister as they watched the newlyweds receive congratulations. "Girl's been good for him." "They've been good for each other," Mrs. Hollister corrected, a rare softness in her voice. "Sometimes the Lord brings people together at exactly the right moment, though it may not seem so at the time." The couple departed Whitefish a week later, their few possessions packed onto a wagon Jackson had purchased with part of his winter earnings. They headed west, toward the Idaho Territory and the promise of a new beginning. The journey would take weeks, but they were in no hurry, savoring the freedom of the open country and each other's company. They traveled through spectacular landscapes, towering mountains, vast prairies, dense forests, camping beside clear streams and sleeping beneath star-filled skies. For Rebecca, who had never ventured beyond Montana since her family's arrival from Pennsylvania, each day brought new wonders. Jackson, more experienced in Western travel, but seeing it anew through her eyes, found himself pointing out sights he might once have taken for granted: an eagle's nest high in a pine, a herd of antelope moving like smoke across a distant hillside, wildflowers carpeting a mountain meadow in brilliant color. "I never imagined the world could be so beautiful," Rebecca said one evening as they sat beside their campfire, the day's travel behind them. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, silhouetting the mountains they would cross in the days ahead. Jackson watched her face in the firelight, still sometimes disbelieving his good fortune. "Nor did I imagine I'd be sharing it with someone like you," he admitted. "I'd gotten used to being alone." Rebecca smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Do you regret it, giving up your wandering life?" "Not for a moment," he answered without hesitation. "The open country will always be there, but finding someone to share it with, that's the real gift." They reached the Palouse country in early May when the rolling hills were vibrant with spring growth. Just as Jackson had heard, the land was fertile beyond imagining, rich soil deposited over centuries by ancient floods, capable of producing abundant crops with proper farming. They spent days exploring, looking for the right place to stake their claim. They found it on a gentle slope overlooking a small creek, with timber nearby for building and a natural spring bubbling up from the earth. The surrounding hills offered good grazing for the livestock they hoped to acquire, and the soil, when Jackson dug his hands into it, was black and crumbly, perfect for the wheat and vegetables they planned to grow. "This is it," Rebecca said, standing in the center of what would become their homestead, turning slowly to take in the 360-degree view. "I can see our future here." Jackson nodded, already mentally planning the cabin he would build, where to place the barn, how to irrigate fields from the creek. "It's good land, better than I hoped to find." They made camp there that night, the first of many they would spend on their new property. The following day, Jackson rode to the nearest settlement to file their claim while Rebecca began the work of creating their first garden. By the time he returned 3 days later, she had cleared a patch of ground and planted some of the vegetable seeds they'd brought from Montana. "It's official," he announced, swinging down from his horse with a grin. 160 acres registered in both our names. We're landowners, Mrs. Vance." Rebecca laughed at the formal address, still getting used to her new surname. "And did you find the supplies we need?" "Everything but glass for the windows. That will have to wait, for there's a shipment coming from Portland next month." He began unloading the provisions he'd purchased: tools, nails, seed, and most importantly, a small cook stove that would serve until he could build a proper stone fireplace. They worked from dawn to dusk in those early weeks, establishing their homestead bit by bit. Jackson felled trees and began construction on their cabin while Rebecca tended the garden, cooked their meals, and helped with the building when an extra pair of hands was needed. It was exhausting work, but deeply satisfying to see their home taking shape day by day. The cabin was simple but solid: one large room with a sleeping loft above, sturdy walls of notched logs sealed with clay, and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm through the coming winter. When the glass finally arrived for the windows, Jackson installed it with careful precision, knowing how much Rebecca treasured the natural light it would allow into their home. "It's perfect," she declared when the last window was in place, standing in the center of the cabin that still smelled of fresh cut wood and new beginnings. "Better than I ever imagined." Jackson pulled her into his arms, his expression serious. "Are you truly happy here, Rebecca?" "It's a far cry from the life you might have had back east." She looked up at him, this man who had become her whole world. "I wouldn't trade this life for any other," she said firmly. "This is where I belong, with you." As summer progressed into fall, their homestead flourished. The garden produced abundantly, allowing Rebecca to preserve food for the winter ahead. Jackson built furniture for their cabin: a table, chairs, shelves, and a proper bed frame to replace the simple platform they'd been using. He also constructed a small barn and corral, anticipating the livestock they would acquire when finances permitted. They weren't wealthy by any standard, but they were comfortable and self-sufficient. More importantly, they were happy, finding joy in the simple rhythms of their shared life and in each other's company. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit on the porch Jackson had added to the front of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the Palouse Hills in deepening shades of gold and purple, making plans for their future that now seemed limitless with possibility. Winter arrived earlier than expected that first year, with a November snowstorm that blanketed their homestead in white. Rebecca stood at the cabin door, watching the snow fall in thick, lazy flakes, remembering another snowy day when she had stood barefoot and bereft before the ruins of her family home. "What are you thinking about?" Jackson asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist. "How much has changed in a year?" she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Last winter I had nothing, now I have everything." Jackson pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Come inside," he said, echoing words spoken on that fateful day when they first met. "It's getting cold." Rebecca turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to kiss him properly. "I love you, Jackson Vance," she said when they parted, the words simple but heartfelt, his blue eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled down at her. "And I love you, Rebecca Vance, more than I ever thought possible." Hand in hand, they stepped back into the warmth of their cabin, closing the door on the falling snow and the past, embracing the future they had built together, a future that had begun the moment a barefoot woman and a kind-hearted cowboy had found each other in the depths of winter's cold. Spring came to the palace with an explosion of wildflowers across the rolling hills. Rebecca and Jackson's first year on their homestead had been successful beyond their expectations. Their fall wheat planting had wintered well and now stretched in emerald waves across the southern slope of their property. The vegetable garden, expanded from the previous year, promised another bountiful harvest. In the small corral behind the barn, 2 milk cows, 4 horses, and a dozen chickens represented the beginning of their livestock holdings. But the greatest blessing of all was the secret Rebecca had been harboring for several weeks now, a secret she could no longer keep to herself, as the evidence became increasingly apparent. She chose a perfect moment to share the news, a Sunday afternoon in late April, when they were walking along the creek that bordered their property. The day was warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming wildflowers and fresh grass. Jackson had been talking about plans to expand the barn that summer, anticipating the addition of more livestock as their farm prospered. "We might need to think about expanding the cabin too," Rebecca said casually, watching his profile from the corner of her eye. Jackson glanced at her. "The cabin, it's plenty big for us right now." "For us, yes," Rebecca agreed, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. "But come winter, there will be 3 of us, not 2. Jackson stopped walking so abruptly he nearly stumbled. His eyes widened as he looked at his wife, comprehension dawning slowly on his face. "Rebecca," he breathed, his voice barely audible over the babbling creek. "Are you saying—" She nodded, suddenly nervous despite the joy bubbling up inside her. "I'm with child, Jackson. Due around November, I think." For a moment, he simply stared at her, an unreadable expression on his face. Then, without warning, he let out a whoop of pure joy that echoed across the hills. In the next instant, his arms were around her, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle as laughter spilled from both of them. "Careful," Rebecca gasped between bursts of laughter. "The baby!" Jackson set her down immediately, his hands gentle as they came to rest on her waist. "I'm sorry," he said, though his face showed no remorse at all, only radiant happiness. "Are you all right? Is the baby?" "We're both fine," she assured him, covering his hands with her own. "I've suspected for a few weeks now, but I wanted to be certain before I told you." "A baby," Jackson said wonderingly, his eyes bright with emotion. "Our baby." He knelt suddenly before her, pressing his ear to her stomach as if he might hear something, though it was far too early for that. Rebecca laughed softly, running her fingers through his hair. "You won't hear anything yet, silly man." "I don't care," he murmured, his voice thick with feeling. "I just want to be close to both of you." They remained by the creek for a long time, making plans and dreaming of the future. Jackson insisted they would need to add at least 2 rooms to the cabin, one for the baby and one for visitors, since Rebecca's pregnancy had intensified his desire to help her reconnect with whatever family she might have left in Pennsylvania. "We should write to them," he said as they walked hand in hand back toward their cabin. "Your mother's family, at least, they should know they have a grandchild coming." Rebecca hesitated. She had thought of her mother's sister occasionally over the past year but hadn't felt ready to reach out. The pain of her parents' loss had eased with time and happiness, but establishing contact with her aunt would inevitably bring memories, both sweet and painful, rushing back. "Perhaps," she said noncommittally, "though they probably think I'm dead by now." "It's been over 2 years since they've heard from us." "All the more reason to write," Jackson urged gently. "Family is important, Rebecca. Our child should know their heritage on both sides." Rebecca squeezed his hand in acknowledgement, knowing he was right. "I'll write to Aunt Sarah soon," she promised. "And what about your family? You've never spoken much about them." A shadow crossed Jackson's face so briefly Rebecca might have imagined it if she hadn't been watching closely. "Not much to tell," he said with a shrug that aimed for casual but didn't quite achieve it. "Mother died when I was young. Father and I didn't see eye to eye. We parted ways when I was 16, as I told you, and you've had no contact since." Rebecca pressed gently, sensing there was more to the story. Jackson was silent for several steps before answering. "I wrote a few times in the early years. Letters came back unopened." His jaw tightened. "Eventually, I stopped trying." Rebecca's heart ached for the boy he had been alone and rejected, making his way in a harsh world. It explained so much about the man he'd become: his self-reliance, his initial reluctance to form attachments, his deeply hidden but profound longing for connection. "I'm sorry," she said simply, knowing no words could erase that old hurt. Jackson's expression softened as he looked down at her. "Don't be. If things had been different with my father, I might never have come west, might never have been passing by your homestead that day." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Everything that happened led me to you, and that makes it all worthwhile." The summer passed in a blur of activity as they prepared for both the harvest and the baby's arrival. Jackson added 2 rooms to the cabin, working in the long evening light after the day's farm chores were complete. Rebecca sewed baby clothes from fabric purchased on their monthly trips to the growing settlement of Moscow, 15 miles away. She also, true to her promise, wrote to her Aunt Sarah in Pennsylvania, sharing news of her marriage and impending motherhood. The response, when it came 2 months later, brought tears to Rebecca's eyes, tears of relief and happiness. Her aunt had indeed feared the worst when letters from Montana ceased, but had continued to hope and pray for her niece's safety. The lengthy letter was filled with family news, warm congratulations on Rebecca's marriage, and excited anticipation of the grandniece or grandnephew soon to join the family. Most surprising of all was Aunt Sarah's expressed desire to visit the following summer if Rebecca and Jackson were amenable. "Of course she must come," Jackson said when Rebecca showed him the letter. "We'll have plenty of room now with the addition to the cabin." Rebecca smiled at his enthusiasm. "She'll like you," she predicted. Aunt Sarah always had good judgment about people. As Rebecca's pregnancy progressed, her body changed, growing round with new life. Jackson watched these changes with fascination and tenderness, his hands gentle as they traced the curve of her expanding belly in the privacy of their bed. Despite his initial concerns about her working too hard, Rebecca insisted on maintaining most of her usual routines, though she accepted help more readily than before and rested when fatigue overtook her. The wheat harvest in late August was successful beyond their hopes, yielding enough to sell a substantial portion after setting aside what they needed for themselves. The profit allowed them to purchase more livestock, additional cattle, and a pair of sturdy workhorses that would make next year's planting easier. They also invested in a better wagon and more comfortable furniture for the cabin, including a proper crib for the baby, which Jackson insisted on buying rather than making, as he wanted only the best for their child. As autumn painted the Palouse Hills in shades of gold and amber, Rebecca found herself thinking often of that day nearly 2 years ago when she had stood barefoot in the snow, her world reduced to ashes and despair. How impossible it would have seemed then to imagine where life would lead her: to a new territory, a thriving farm, a loving marriage, and now the imminent arrival of a child. "You're miles away," Jackson observed one evening in early November as they sat before the fireplace in their comfortable cabin. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, coating the world in pristine white. Rebecca smiled, rubbing her rounded belly where the baby was particularly active. Just thinking about how much has changed, how fortunate we are, Jackson nodded, reaching over to cover her hand with his. The most fortunate day of my life was finding you, even though it didn't seem like good fortune for either of us at the time. God works in mysterious ways, Rebecca quoted softly. My mother used to say that when things didn't make sense, I understand it better now. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick, visible even through Rebecca's dress. Jackson laughed, delighted as always by these tangible signs of their child's vitality. Strong little thing, he commented, his hand joining Rebecca's on her belly. Takes after its mother. Rebecca smiled, but it quickly transformed into a grimace as a different kind of sensation rippled across her abdomen. Jackson's expression changed instantly from amusement to concern. Rebecca, what is it? She took a deep breath as the feeling subsided. Nothing to worry about. Just practice contractions. The midwife in Moscow said I might feel them for weeks before the actual birth. Jackson relaxed slightly, though a hint of worry remained in his eyes. The baby's impending arrival filled him with both anticipation and anxiety. Despite Rebecca's reassurances that childbirth was a natural process and that she was healthy and strong, he couldn't help but fear for her safety. Too many women died in childbirth, even young, vigorous ones like his wife. Perhaps we should send for Mrs. Larson earlier than planned, he suggested, referring to the experienced midwife who had agreed to attend the birth. With the snow starting, there's plenty of time, Rebecca assured him. First babies often come late, not early, Mrs. Larson said not to expect anything until mid-November at least, but Rebecca's body had its own timetable. 3 nights later, she woke in the darkness to a sharp pain and the unmistakable sensation of fluid soaking the bed. Jackson, she whispered, shaking his shoulder. Jackson, wake up. It's time. He was instantly alert, sitting up and lighting the bedside lamp with hands that trembled slightly. Are you sure? It's still early. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than the practice ones had been, answering his question more eloquently than words could have. Jackson's face paled, but he moved with decisive efficiency, helping her to a chair while he changed the bedding, then building up the fire and putting water on to boil as the midwife had instructed. I need to go for Mrs. Larson, he said, pulling on his clothes with haste. Rebecca nodded, breathing carefully through another contraction. Hurry, she managed when it passed. I think this baby is impatient to meet us. The journey to Moscow and back would take hours, even pushing the horses to their limits. Rebecca tried not to think about that as Jackson kissed her goodbye and disappeared into the snowy night. Instead, she focused on preparing as best she could, arranging clean linens, positioning herself comfortably on the bed, and practicing the breathing techniques Mrs. Larson had taught her. The hours passed with increasing discomfort as the contractions grew stronger and more frequent. Rebecca found herself walking the cabin floor during the periods between pains, then gripping the bedpost during the waves of contraction. She tried to mark the passage of time, but it became increasingly difficult to focus on anything beyond the powerful forces at work within her body. Dawn was breaking when she heard the blessed sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin. The door burst open to admit a snow-covered Jackson and a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, carrying a large bag of supplies. Well, Mrs. Larson said briskly, removing her coat and immediately washing her hands in the basin Rebecca had prepared. Someone's in a hurry to join the world, I see. The midwife's calm competence was reassuring as she examined Rebecca and declared everything to be progressing normally. The baby's head is in the right position, she announced. You're doing wonderfully, Mrs. Vance. Jackson hovered anxiously until Mrs. Larson shooed him outside. Go tend to your animals, she ordered. We'll call you when there's news. The final stages of labor tested Rebecca's endurance to its limits. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced, yet strangely, she found herself able to work with it rather than against it, following Mrs. Larson's instructions to push when told and rest when possible. Through it all, she held onto the knowledge that each contraction brought her closer to holding her child. Just as the winter sun reached its zenith, flooding the cabin with pale light, Rebecca gave a final, monumental push, and her baby slipped into the world with a lusty cry that spoke of healthy lungs and a strong constitution. "A boy, Mrs." Larson announced triumphantly, quickly wiping the infant's face and placing him on Rebecca's chest. "A fine, strong boy." Rebecca stared in wonder at the tiny, red-faced being who blinked up at her with unfocused eyes. Dark hair, still damp from birth, curled against his forehead in a way that immediately reminded her of Jackson. As if summoned by the thought, the cabin door opened and her husband stepped tentatively inside, his face a study in mingled fear and hope. "Come meet your son," Rebecca said softly, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the joy of the moment. Jackson approached the bed with reverence, his eyes wide as he gazed down at the newborn. "A son," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Gently, as if handling the most precious and fragile treasure in the world, he reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. 5 perfect fingers immediately curled around his calloused index finger in a grip surprisingly strong for one so new to the world. "He's perfect," Jackson whispered, tears gathering in his eyes. "You're both perfect." They named him William after Rebecca's father, with Thomas as a middle name to honor the grandfather Jackson had spoken of with rare fondness. William Thomas Vance entered the world on the first significant snowfall of winter, strong and healthy despite arriving earlier than expected, a trait, Jackson joked, that he must have inherited from his decisive mother. The first weeks of William's life passed in a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and precious moments of discovery, as his parents learned his unique personality and preferences. He disliked being swaddled too tightly, but slept best when held close to his mother's heartbeat. He had his father's serious expression when studying something new and his mother's quick smile when pleased. Winter deepened around their snug cabin, but inside, all was warmth and joy. Jackson proved to be a devoted father, as willing to walk the floor with a fussy infant as he was to change diapers or bring Rebecca water while she nursed their son. In the evenings, he would hold William on his chest as they sat by the fire, telling him stories about the land they were building together, the legacy that would one day be his. "He's too young to understand," Rebecca pointed out one night, smiling at the serious way Jackson explained crop rotation to their 2-month-old son. "Maybe," Jackson conceded, "but it's never too early to learn about the things that matter." He looked up at her, his expression soft with love. "Family, home, the land that provides for us." As winter gave way to spring, the Vance family settled into new routines that accommodated both the needs of a growing infant and the demands of farm life. Rebecca worked in the garden with William napping nearby in a basket, his fair skin protected from the sun by a canopy Jackson had rigged. When she needed to work in the house, a cradle in the kitchen kept the baby close at hand. Jackson took on more of the household tasks than was typical for men of that era, wanting to spare Rebecca as much physical labor as possible while she was still nursing their son. His willingness to knead bread dough or hang laundry raised eyebrows when neighbors visited, but Jackson merely shrugged off their comments. "My wife gave me a son," he said simply, when a neighboring farmer made a joke about women's work. "The least I can do is make her life easier where I can." The arrival of Aunt Sarah from Pennsylvania in early summer brought fresh joy to the homestead. The older woman fell instantly in love with her grandnephew, declaring him the very image of Rebecca as a baby, except for those Vance eyes. She integrated seamlessly into their household, her practical nature and good humor making her a welcome addition rather than an intrusion. Sarah's presence also gave Rebecca and Jackson their first opportunity for time alone since William's birth. On a perfect June evening, with the sun setting in a spectacular display of color over the Palouse Hills, they rode to their favorite spot by the creek, spread a blanket, and enjoyed a simple picnic of bread, cheese, and early strawberries from Rebecca's garden. "I've missed this," Rebecca admitted as they sat side by side watching the water flow past. "Just us." Jackson took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. We should make time for it more often. Sarah would be happy to watch William. Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she couldn't have imagined when they first met. I love our son more than I thought possible, she said softly, but I love you differently, not less, just differently. I understand, Jackson murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. What we've built together, it's the foundation for everything else, including William. They sat in companionable silence as twilight deepened around them, listening to the creek's gentle murmur and the evening songs of birds settling for the night. When Jackson finally spoke again, his voice held a note Rebecca hadn't heard before, a mixture of vulnerability and determination. I've been thinking about my father, he said, staring out at the darkening landscape. About writing to him. Rebecca turned to look at him, surprised. After all this time, Jackson nodded slowly. William made me see things differently, made me understand my father better, perhaps. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I keep thinking about what I would feel if William someday left and never contacted me again, how empty that would be. Your situations were different, Rebecca reminded him gently. You had good reasons for leaving. Maybe, but I'm not the angry boy I was at 16, and he's not getting any younger. Jackson's expression was thoughtful, with no trace of the bitterness that had once colored his rare mentions of his father. I'd like William to know his grandfather, if that's possible, and I'd like my father to know he has a grandson. Rebecca squeezed his hand supportively. Then write to him. The worst he can do is not respond, and you've already lived with that. I will, Jackson decided, turning to face her fully. In the fading light, his features were softened, boyish almost. Thank you for understanding. Always, Rebecca promised, leaning forward to kiss him. The kiss deepened, awakening sensations that had been set aside in the exhaustion of early parenthood. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing faster, a familiar heat building between them. Perhaps, Jackson suggested, his voice low and intimate, we should take full advantage of Sarah's babysitting. Rebecca laughed, the sound as clear and joyful as the creek beside them. Perhaps we should. They rode home later that night beneath a canopy of stars, their hearts as full as the moon that illuminated their way. In the years to come, they would face challenges, drought seasons, illness, the usual hardships of frontier life, but they would face them together, strengthened by the love that had bloomed from an unexpected meeting on a snow-covered homestead. The letter Jackson wrote to his father did receive a response, tentative at first, then gradually warming as correspondence continued. The following summer, James Vance made the journey from Texas to Idaho, a weathered, serious man whose stern expression melted the first time William toddled across the cabin floor and raised his arms to his grandfather in unquestioning welcome. Rebecca's Aunt Sarah visited each summer until William was 5, when she made the decision to move permanently to Idaho, buying a small house in Moscow so she could be near her beloved grandnephew and the niece who had become like a daughter to her. The Vance homestead prospered over the years. The one-room cabin grew into a comfortable farmhouse as their family expanded to include a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, born when William was 3, and another son, Michael James, who arrived 2 years after that. Each child brought new joy and deepened the bond between Rebecca and Jackson, whose love matured and strengthened with the passing seasons. Sometimes, on winter evenings when snow fell softly outside their warm home, Rebecca would remind their children of how she and their father had met. I was standing barefoot in the snow, she would begin, smiling at the memory that no longer held pain. And then your father rode up on his horse and said, "Let's go inside." And you did, William would prompt, knowing the story by heart but never tiring of it. I did, Rebecca would agree, her eyes meeting Jackson's across the room. It was the best decision I ever made. Jackson would always smile at this part, the same smile that had first captured her heart all those years ago. No, Rebecca, he would correct softly. The best decision was mine to stop that day when I saw smoke on the horizon and investigate instead of riding on. Their children would groan good-naturedly at this exchange, but secretly they treasured the story of their parents meeting the beginning of the love that had created their family and the homestead they all called home. And on the coldest nights, When the wind howled around the eaves of the farmhouse they had built together, Rebecca and Jackson would lie close beneath warm quilts, their hands finding each other in the darkness, just as they had found each other in the vast wilderness of the West unexpectedly. Yet somehow exactly when and where they were meant to.